Hey guys, so this is the third part of our Spawning Bettas Start to Finish series, and today we're just going to talk about some of the things you want to get and have on hand before you spawn your fish. Specifically, we're going to talk about what you need for your spawn tank, and then a little bit about some of the foods and stuff you're going to want to have on hand for your fry. Now, before I start, I have to mention there's many ways to spawn bettas, many methods, and so what I do might not work for you, or someone else might have a method that works better for them. There's no one right answer. You kind of just have to pick a method, try it out, and if it doesn't work, try something different. I will say that this kind of standard method is generally what works for most people, regardless of where you live or what your setup is. But by no means am I trying to say that this is the best method or the only method. This is just what works best for me and what I generally advise when I'm mentoring new breeders. So let's first start with the spawn tank. Now, I like a 5-gallon glass tank. The reason I like glass is because I want to be able to see inside, so I can monitor the fry, monitor the pair very closely. That's just a personal preference. I've definitely used many things to spawn fry or spawn bettas, and I've spawned them in plastic dish pans, 5-gallon buckets, large bowls, many things. So whatever you use for your spawn tank, just make sure that it holds water. And for new breeders, I generally recommend something that is close to a 5 or 10-gallon footprint. I don't generally recommend new breeders spawn in something smaller, just because there's less margin of error when you have a smaller tank. So I generally recommend new breeders go with something larger. That way it's easier for them to monitor in case there's damage or too much aggression or something like that. So we have our tank, we have a lid. This is just a piece of corrugated polycarbonate roofing panel that I cut to fit this tank. Any lid will work, whether it's, you know, a black plastic stock lid or a glass lid, or even something like a plastic trash bag or saran wrap works really well. You just want something that's fairly tight fitting, that's going to hold in the humidity so that the air above the water is going to be humid. That will help keep the male's bubble nest together, keep it from breaking up. Also in here we have a heater and a thermometer over here. Obviously I live somewhere where it gets really cold in the winter, and my fish room is not enclosed, so I can't heat it. So I have to keep heaters in my tanks, or use under tank not space heaters, mat heaters, or heat cables or something like that. If you live somewhere that's tropical, you might not need a heater, but we want to shoot for a temperature of about 82 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit for our spawn tank. So just be sure that whatever method of heating you use, you're able to hit that temp or thereabout that temp. The other thing I add to my spawn tanks is a cycled sponge filter. This filter is in some tank water so that the bacteria doesn't die. I keep this in my tank at all times, running at all times. I have not found it to be detrimental to the male building his bubble nest, or make it hard for the fry to swim or anything like that. I connect it to my air pump, and I connect a valve to it so I can adjust how much air is going to the sponge filter, so it's set very low, and it allows the water to still be getting filtered without disturbing the male or the fry. So I always have a sponge filter in my tanks. Some people prefer to add them after the fry are free swimming. That's totally up to you, but it definitely does not hurt to add it from the beginning. I try to keep my spare sponge filters in a cycled tank at all times, preferably a planted tank, because planted tanks will have naturally occurring microfauna and small organisms. Those will grow on the sponge filter and be a source of food for the fry, a secondary source of food, I should say. I add salt to my fry tanks and my spawn tanks at the rate of 1 tablespoon per 5 gallons. This is canning and pickling salt. It's pretty much the same thing as aquarium salt, just finer grain, so it dissolves faster, and it's also much cheaper. One like 5-pound box of this costs like $1, so very cheap. And salt has been scientifically proven to prevent velvet in young betta fry. And velvet is something that can kill fry very, very quickly. Oftentimes in the past, when I've not used salt, I've had fry die basically overnight, and they're so tiny that you can't really see the velvet on them. So I always keep salt in my spawn tanks, and usually I don't have any issues with velvet because of the salt. So it's kind of controversial. Some people don't believe in it, but I highly recommend it. Again, it's totally up to you if you use it or not. And that's pretty much the basic setup of my spawn tanks. I use a tank, I have my lid, my heater, my cycled filter. Cycled is very important. Don't just put a new filter in there, because without the bacteria, it's basically useless. You want to take the time to make sure this filter is well aged, it's harboring the bacteria that can filter the water. And then again, I add salt. And that's all that's in my tank, besides a nest spot for the male. I don't add hiding places. I find that the sponge filter and the heater act as hiding places enough. And I've personally found that if you add too many plants, too many hiding spots, the male can tend to lose the female, and it can cause it to take a lot longer for the spawn to happen. So again, judgment call on that. I just personally prefer to have a more blank tank, and then once I have the female out and once I have the male out and the fry are free swimming, that's when I start adding stuff like live plants. I'm a big fan of live plants. Again, they're going to house microfauna that the fry can munch on between feedings. If you have snails in there, the snails will break down any uneaten food and again create more infusoria. So it creates more of a mini ecosystem. Plants also obviously help keep the water clean. So I'm a big fan of keeping live plants in my fry tanks. If you don't have good lighting or just aren't comfortable with live plants, it's not necessary at all. It's just what I found that works really well. It's kind of like insurance, because the plants help keep the water clean. So if you were to have a mini ammonia spike or something like that, normally the plants would be able to take care of it, and you'll have less issue with fry death. So that's basically all we have for our spawn setup. For my nest site, what I prefer to use is a small piece of bubble wrap. This is about, I don't know, 2 by 1.5 inches, something like that. The size doesn't really matter. And the reason I love this so much is the males tend to seem to think that this is it looks like a nest to them, so they'll just immediately start adding bubbles to it right away. And that allows me to kind of control where they build their nest. Oftentimes, if you don't use bubble wrap, the males will just put the nest wherever they want to, and that's perfectly fine. I just personally prefer to have the bubble wrap there. That way I can situate it toward the front of the tank. That way I can snoop on the pair and on the male and see the fry and see what he's doing. Other things you can use are plastic lids, styrofoam cups, anything like that works well. Anything that's got a place that has like a little bit of air under it will work just fine. I've personally found that a little piece of bubble wrap with a small piece of almond or catappa leaf on top really makes a good nest spot, and 9.99 times out of 10 that is where the male will build his bubble nest. Every once in a while you get a weird male that just says he's not going to build it there, that's not where he wants it, and he'll go build his nest over in the corner somewhere. But most times, if you provide them with a a site for the nest, that's generally where they will build it. So that's the only other thing I add to my spawn tanks. We'll talk about a couple other things that you want to have on hand before you spawn, and then some things you might want to consider but you don't necessarily need to have right before you spawn. Obviously, fry foods are something you're going to want to have before you breed. And I can't even count how many times I've seen threads on groups and forums and have people message me, and they've bred their bettas and they don't have any food, and they're asking me, well, what do I feed them? Can I feed them this? Can I feed them that? And it makes me want to slam my head against the wall sometimes, because why would you breed something and not have food already ready to go to feed it? So as soon as it is needing food, you have it ready. So make sure you have your food ready. Now what I use micro worms, vinegar eels, and infusoria created from plants. I don't generally culture infusoria separately. You definitely can do that if you want to, though. And then I use brine shrimp. For the first week, I'll generally feed something like micro worms, which I have here, or vinegar eels, and supplement it with brine shrimp. And then once they're a week old, I usually stop doing the nematodes and just do solely brine shrimp until they're about 4 weeks old and can take different food. If you're in a different country where you're not able to get brine shrimp eggs for whatever reason, there's many other things you can feed. I've heard people feed very small Daphnia, egg yolk, crushed purified beef or liquefied beef heart. There's many things, but what works best for me and the gold standard for most betta breeders I know is newly hatched baby brine shrimp. There's a million YouTube videos out there on how to hatch brine shrimp eggs, so I'm not going to go into it. You basically make a DIY hatchery like this one, or buy one that's already pre-made and hatch your shrimp. You're going to want to run 2 hatcheries so you constantly have a supply of shrimp, because it does take about 18 to 24 hours for these eggs to hatch. So you're going to want to have, one always ready to feed while the other one is hatching. So generally you want 2 hatcheries going at the same time. But as far as nutrition goes, you really can't beat newly hatched baby brine shrimp for nutrition. They're just so packed with nutrition in such a tiny package that your fry just grows so well when they're fed brine shrimp. So definitely have your food ready to go before you spawn. There are only other 2 things that you might want to think about. You generally don't have to have before you spawn is a grow out tank. Obviously, if you're using something like a 5-gallon tank, you really can't grow the spawn out to jarring size in there unless it's a small spawn. I've grown out spawns of about 20 to 30 in a 5-gallon tank to jarring size and had no problems. But generally you're going to want at least a 10-gallon, if not a 20 or 30-gallon, to grow out your fry. Obviously, the bigger the tank you move them into for grow out, the longer you'll be able to keep them in there. For the most part, sometimes they start fighting really early no matter what size they're in, and you have to jar them little, but generally if you put them in like a 40-gallon tank, they'll get bigger before they start fighting. So figure out what you're going to do for a grow out tank once your fry need to be moved. Generally for a 5-gallon tank, I move them around 3 weeks to a month old. Some people move them really early, like as soon as they're free swimming. Some of them move them even later. It's just a judgment call. You kind of have to play it by ear with when you move them to a grow out tank, if you move them at all. If you spawn in a 10-gallon, most people can grow their fry out in a 10-gallon until they're jarring size. Of course, if you want to move them to a bigger tank, that's definitely a great idea. And then the last thing, again, you don't need to spawn your fish, but you want to be thinking about and planning for is, what are you going to put your fish in when it's time to jar them? Normally I use something like this, which is a 32-ounce deli cup. I do also keep my fish in beanies, such as those guys over there. But those are hard to find now, and I generally don't recommend them if you're just starting out. Deli cups work great. Old soda bottles work great. Mason jars, glass jars. Basically anything that will hold water can work as a jar. So you have to be figuring out what kind of jar you're going to want to use, how many you want. I generally recommend 25 to 50 jars. I find that most new breeders aren't super duper successful and get 600 fry surviving. It can definitely happen, but most people, you know, they make a mistake here, a mistake there, and they end up with maybe 20 or 30 fry. So you definitely don't need to have 150 jars on hand right away. I don't even recommend having 150 jars, period. I find people are going to burn themselves out and quit breeding if they take on too many jars. So 25 to 50 jars to start, and then be willing to either keep your fish in the grow out tank, the ones that you don't want to jar, or look into culling options. Unless you want to have more jars. So again, you don't have to have jars right away, but definitely be thinking about where you're going to get them, what kind you're going to use, and how are you going to heat them. I use heat mats for my jars. Other people set their jars up in a small closet or a spare bathroom and put a space heater in there to keep it warm. Other people have enclosed fish rooms that they heat with a space heater. And other people are lucky enough to live somewhere tropical and they don't need a heater at all. So that's just something to consider while you're in the middle of doing all your planning. So that's it, guys. That's basically everything I use to spawn. And then, you know, we talked a little bit about some things that you're going to need afterwards when you're raising the fry. In our next video, we're going to introduce our pairs into setup spawn tanks. So we'll go over again the spawn tank in that video so you guys can see what it actually looks like set up. We'll introduce our pairs, and with any luck, we'll get them to spawn and see some babies. So that video should be out very soon. I'm planning to set those tanks up, if not today, definitely this weekend. So with any luck, by early next week, we should have the last part of this series out for you guys. As always, thank you for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with me, and I will see you guys in the next video.